Hello, and welcome to Mayor Brown's podcast series, Credibly Challenged. This podcast focuses on risk management issues for financial institutions of all sizes, particularly those in the banking sector. My name is Matt Bisanz, and I'm a partner in Mayor Brown's financial services regulatory and enforcement practice. Joining me today is Kim Olson. Kim is the Executive Officer and Chief Risk Officer Americas at Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation. On today's program, we'll talk about the complexities of risk management in a cross-border banking organization and some of Kim's experiences coming to risk management. Kim, thank you for being on today's program.
Matthew, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here.
So to dive into things, tell me a bit about the risk management function at your institution. How is it structured? How is it part of the global organization?
Sure, Matthew. First of all, risk is second line of defense. And the Americas Division Risk Team is structured actually pretty similarly to how U.S. Bank risk management functions would be structured. Namely, we have risk verticals. So we have a credit vertical, a market risk vertical, a liquidity risk vertical. Model risk is very important. Non-financial risk, which includes operational risk, cyber risk, IT risk, third-party risk management, and enterprise risk, which would cover things such as risk appetite, our stress testing. So basically those verticals create basically, how we oversee and look at risk within the Americas. We report in to the head office risk department. And they, oversee basically these risks also globally. One of the things I think is very important is the three lines of defense. That is so important in the Americas, for in particular US bank regulators and supervisors, and we definitely fall under those lines. So risk is second line. First line is the business. They own the risk. We review and challenge that risk and, work with them very carefully to be sure risks are mitigated and appropriately controlled. And then our third line of defense is audit, which basically makes sure that, the first and the second line are doing what they say they're going to be doing and living up to basically, within the policies that are set forth.
With those similarities in mind, are there things you've seen at your institution that differ in risk management from some of your more US-centric peers?
Matthew, so yes and no. I mean, I think, what is different is a little bit the regulatory construct within which foreign banking operations sit versus US banks, especially if you have a big branch, right? So we though are under enhanced prudential supervision. It manifests a little bit differently than, say, a US depository institution would be regulated and supervised. That said, we have to adhere to all of the standards within the US, but we also have to, meet the home country regulations as well. So while I mostly focus on US matters, the implementation of whatever the standards are from head office, we have to make sure that we abide by those and we're mitigating risk in accordance with them as well. So we kind of have a dual set, whereas a US centric peer, will be more focused, at least within the Americas, really on the US standards.
I'm aware that Japan has some quite sophisticated, particularly around resolution planning is where I've seen it, that they have sophisticated resolution planning requirements. And obviously the US has those kind of things as well. So I'm not surprised to hear that you also have on the EPS side of things a balancing act of complying with both the US and the home country. So that makes a lot of sense. Um,
Definitely.
when you're talking about working with the different lines of defense and management and also the regulators, what are some of the ways that your best practices or techniques for communicating risk matters to them, particularly when maybe there are parts of the business that aren't as sophisticated about the risk verticals, risk quantification, or levels of risk as you may be?
Yeah, so Matthew, I think the first thing is I really try to get on the same page. One of the things I really want to do is from the business perspective or, from a different division, it may be a controls division or an infrastructure division, is, what is the issue that we're trying to solve? A clear statement of what the problem statement is and what the factors are that either that business or division is facing is very, very important in helping to construct solutions. I think also, the other thing that I really try to do is understand not only the problem statement, but how might we solve a particular problem, right? And so what I kind of call it is getting to the then basically of what's the issue? Do we see it commonly? If we don't see it in the same way, where's the rub? What can we do to basically understand it? And then from a risk perspective, what are the things that we absolutely need to make sure are looked at and solution for? And what I do try to do is really help the business partner really understand why, right? That might be because, if we don't measure and manage the risk, it could be runaway risk and it's really important. It could be that there's an infrastructure issue that could give rise to risk. It could be that there's a regulatory requirement that is new or different, and if we don't plan for it, it could create a risk, right? So I think that dialogue, short story short, is important. The how do we define the problem? Are we on the same page? And
Mhm.
how might we look at a solution and work together to get there? And that's really my approach.
And then thinking about after the decision has been made, when you're getting to some of, particularly since you mentioned when internal audit is looking at the effectiveness of risk management or the effectiveness of the business lines in doing their part. How do you manage that after the event or after the decision review to minimize second guessing or get to a clean audit report?
Yeah, so here, I think what's critical is it's not just what's the problem and what might you do, but it's truly did you do it and is it working, right? And we in our organization, we call it operationalization and sustainability. And we make sure that we embed basically in our program planning and project management this idea of, sustainability and proving we've gotten to sustainability. And that's really pre-audit, right? So what is it that needs to be in place and what metrics do you need to hit really to prove that you really have implemented the particular solution and it's working? And I think that's actually really critical because if you don't have that and then audit or somebody else comes in and says, well, gee, this isn't working, they really can't either, give you the sign of good health or close out a finding. So, I think it's important to really embed that in the actual planning of it and agree what does good look like, right? And give yourself a little bit of runway also, for to improve basically the solution that you put in place. Because generally version one probably needs some tweaks.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you mentioned sustainability of solutions because that's something that, as a lawyer, I've been hearing a lot about in the last 2 years from clients, maybe a little longer. That once upon a time they would bring us and they would bring consultants in to work on matters, and we would do these enormous reviews, look backs of things. We would build systems, and it was great for us. It got them the job done that they hired us to do. But then we would come back in a few years and they had problems sustaining it, that they just didn't have the manpower, the technical resources, all of those things for whatever the legal problem. Again, if it was an AML review,
Mhm.
if it was a FATCA review, if it was even something like triaging funds for a Volcker Rule compliance program. And so now I'm hearing more and more, particularly from senior managers like you, of when Mayor Brown, when you come in and do this engagement for us, we need you to give us procedures to do it, or we need you to think about how we're going to operationalize it, or that solution you have it's a great solution. It works from a legal perspective, but we can't implement it. And can you help us
Mhm.
find a way that it's something that we can actually implement. And so it's good to hear that it's the same on the risk management side, that you're also tuning your advice for the operational realities of the organization.
Matthew, I just really think that that's so important. And thank you for sharing that. I think, really you can kind of think about it. What's the policy? What do you have to achieve? And then we then go forward to say, okay, what's the operating model? How are you going to get there? What's the interaction either between the lines or the businesses or the handoffs, right? So really getting to that process level. And then I think it's really critical to say what's the infrastructure and how much human talent do you need and how much can you automate, right?
Mhm.
And how over time will you, make sure it runs as seamlessly as possible. And then finally, how do you test to be sure that you're really hitting it? And I think you actually need all of those components to really hit sustainability over time. And you can argue that maybe in the beginning, when you're trying to prove out sustainability, you might not have all the infrastructure in place because that can take a little bit longer to build. But a clear design of what it needs to be and when you need to bring it on board is critical. Or I think over a while, over time, what happens is people don't really follow the routine, right? And you're kind of
Mhm.
back where you started, right? So I look for all of those, and I know our audit function really is very keyed into that as well.
Yeah. Some things that I often see when people are building things for a sustainable future is creating metrics that can be automated, and dashboards that can display the periodic results of metrics or escalate issues. And those are great tools. I mean, we have those own tools that we use within the firm to manage our
Mhm.
processes of, how often we're billing, how long we're collecting things for. We use those same kind of dashboards. They're great, but sometimes I find they can provide a false sense of security that, as long as everything is green, it must be good. And in the risk world, as long as all of the risks are green or low, or like under the threshold, then everything is fine. We're well managed. And how do you guard against that complacency when you are using tools like dashboards or reports of metrics?
So, Matthew, that is a great question, and I'd kind of answer it in a couple of ways. So, first is design, right? So, you can be all green because you designed it so broadly that you'll never trigger something, right? Ever, right? It's just always evergreen. But underneath, the pot is really boiling over, right? Another flaw that can happen is you can design it so granularly, right, that a lot of different things are amber or red, but it's just really a lot of noise and no real signal, right?
Mhm.
So I think first thing is you got to design it so it tells you something, right? And so that it percolates actually issues and raises issues that truly are issues so that you can have kind of early identification to try to do something. So that's the first thing, right? The second thing though is that report may be great, but you can have a regime shift, right? And the variables that you thought were important might change when the markets change radically, or there's a geopolitical disruption that you weren't expecting, right? So you also have to horizon scan, right? And so I think it's both of them. It's the right design and making sure that design, really gives you signal, but also staying open and attuned to what's happening and saying, gee, you know what? These metrics aren't going to capture that, but this is actually giving off emerging risks that we need to think about and possibly recalibrate our metrics or our risk appetite and cut some of the things that we thought that we would do. So I think that's critical. And I think, seasoned risk professionals really have to keep their eye on that. It's kind of science and it's art at the same time.
Yes, there's definitely on again I have the legal bias to it, but the big part where we interact with the risk is around inventories of laws and regulations, and
Mm.
identifying those that create legal risk for an organization, or that are need to be put into to mitigate compliance risk, or manage compliance risk. And often the question I get put is, well, how do we know how to update or track these? And I've noticed that there are a lot of services out there that can sell the infrastructure to put together the initial
Hmm.
inventory, to put it into something like, again, just a vendor like a metric stream type vendor, that they have these great infrastructure programs. But then there is the art to it of someone in the legal department or someone in the compliance department knowing that the annual Federal Register update for civil money penalties, that doesn't matter. That's not worth our time. That's not something we need to pick up. But that annual update that maybe is to our TILA exception
Hmm.
limit, that is something we need to pick up, because that could bring more loans into scope or fewer loans into scope of a disclosure requirement. And so having those kind of seasoned professionals doing the updating process for, again, my world of legal risk, that is so key to maintaining the system.
Yeah, Matthew, I would really agree with that. I also think sometimes with kind of those off the shelf packages too, one of the things that's critical is where's the nuance, right? And what I would say is there's a distinction between regulation and supervision, right?
Mhm.
And often in supervision, there's that nuance tweak that one needs to actually really think about. And I think, you can see that sometimes in speeches that are given by prominent regulators, or you can see that in, some of the actions maybe that come out where there's some phrasing basically that points to areas that are of concern, right, that might not exactly tie back to something. And I think it's really critical to be very thoughtful about that. And what's hard is sometimes they're hard to measure, right? So they're hard to put into a metric, but yet they're very important in terms of how you navigate forward, right? And so
Mhm.
that seasoning and that thoughtfulness is super critical, as one thinks about, I think, inventories and areas that could emerge effectively as risks to the organization.
Yeah. I remember a few years ago, one of the regulators had issued an enforcement action that talked about some aspect of how to structure a compliance program. And everyone saw it and was like, "Oh my, this is a huge deal. We all need to change how we've structured our compliance programs. This is a supervisory insight that, like, yes, it's an enforcement action, but we need to learn from it." And about a month later, I was at a conference where one of the staff from that regulator was speaking, and they're like, we not that we messed up, but we didn't intend this to be a supervisory expectation. It was something specific to that institution. It was unique to that institution's position. Please don't go all changing your things. This wasn't something we were trying to communicate. And I was like, oh yes, good. I'm not the only one who was looking very carefully at that sentence in that enforcement
Right.
action. I'm glad other people are tuned the same way that I am. Uh, but you are right, and I think particularly for emerging risks or emerging trends, a lot of those come across on the supervision side because they haven't made it into climate regulation, or they haven't made it into regulation, and a little Freudian slip there. But one area that I've been seeing as an emerging risk is around ESG risk. That there's no banking regulation that mentions climate change. There's nothing really talking about ESG that I can point to in the CFR, but it is something that all of the regulators are talking about. Some of the regulators have started to convey their supervisory expectations and propose things. And so, where does ESG risk fit into your risk management framework?
So thanks, Matthew. That is a really important and topical, question. So you're right. There isn't a specific, at least in the in the U.S., specific requirements per se from a bank side. But my firm has committed to net zero by 2050. And so in order to reach that, each of the regions, needs to work through the strategy, as well as the risk metrics that will allow us to basically kind of reach that, in concert with head office, right? So we're very much evolving how we look at that. I think from a risk perspective, um, especially we have a pretty big lending book. We're really thinking through what is our carbon intensity? Where does it need to be in order to meet the goals, basically, or the commitment that head office has set? And what are the tools that will help us to do that, from scorecards to scenario testing to portfolio sculpting. So it's very much in build mode. We're very connected with what others in the industry are doing as well. One thing that's really exciting is I think the industry, especially risk professionals, are all really trying to share information as to how to think about it, how to build it, where to get the data from. You can kind of move on to being spuriously accurate, right? And maybe not really measuring something, or what are the big things that you're trying to reach, right? And how do you define that? So as an example, transition risk, moving from maybe hardcore carbon intensity to moving a particular obligor or firm, its commitment basically to using cleaner kind of green fuels, if you will.
Mm.
So how do you measure that transition? How do
Right.
you give weight to it? How do you define that? Those are all very, very important questions and points to answer, right? So that you can
Mhm.
have some form of measurement to see if you're moving towards your goal. So I would say we're very much in that mix right now. It's an
Mhm.
exciting time. There's a lot to be developed, I think, within the industry around that type of measurement and analysis.
And that is something, certainly I've seen a lot of groups opining on it. A lot of groups now offer ratings on this topic, and ranging from colorized ratings all the way to granular, like alphanumeric type ratings.
Hmm.
And it certainly seems to me as one of those things that is going to keep changing, but also is, as you said, you really have to pay attention to what are we doing, and what are we actually measuring. There was at one point someone talking about the change for green loans, and talking about how it was basically some small amount, like a basis point for what was the change in interest rates for green loans versus loans that were not rated as green. And did that basis point really in any meaningful
Hmm.
way map to the associated change in behavior by the borrower, or to a specific climate goal? And for those types of long-term questions, where you're saying, well, look, is this commitment to by a borrower to be net zero by 2050, how does that change a credit risk? Is that the kind of thing that you guys would develop in-house, that your business line would develop, or are there a broader organizations or specialists that you're working with to develop those kind of skill bases?
Kind of say all of the above. I think it's a nascent, kind of science right now, right? So we're definitely thinking about the question and doing our own development. We're also very much in conversation with industry providers. I think that's truly an evolving field, right? I think,
Mhm.
there's different ways to skin the cat, if you will, and they lead to different answers. So we're very much exploring that, and, where possible, using different approaches to come up with something that will hopefully be tractable and lead us to, what I'm going to call signal as opposed to noise, right? I mean, what we want to do is make sure that we can say, yeah, we're looking at this, and, this rating or this assessment is directionally curbing climate risk, or showing that this firm is moving, to a better credit risk, if you will, because it has lessened the amount of climate risk it has over time, right? And so
Right.
we want to be able to measure that in a way that, really helps us make that assessment as opposed to being so granular that it's just noise and not really, a true kind of assessment, if that makes sense. So there's a lot to thrash out there. What's fun about this particular time is there's just a lot of different ways to think about it, right? And I don't think a particular approach has yet emerged as the common denominator, right?
Right.
So there's a lot still to be done, which from a risk perspective makes it very intriguing and interesting.
It's very helpful. And I'd like to take a step back to a time when you were just starting to be involved in risk management. And I think our audience might like to hear a little bit more about how you began that journey to where you are today.
Sure. So, I really started right out of graduate school, and I spent a number of years at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And, for me, it was a wonderful place to start. It was a little bit like academic Disneyland. There were just so many things to learn. Really had the opportunity to go deep, but also look horizontally across basically the industry. And you learn from really great mentors. And it's funny, my children say, I think my life professional goal was always to be chief risk officer. um, I don't know that I knew that at the time, but I did know that I found basically the topics incredibly stimulating, and that ability to be very technical on the one hand, to frame on the other hand, was something that I really learned there. Subsequent to the Fed, have worked at a few different firms and have really been able to move from regulator to rating agency to industry to looking at risk from an insurance perspective, a bank perspective, and as a consultant, a partner consultant. So I feel like I've been able to, almost make the movie in many different ways, right? As
Mhm.
a player, as an actor, as a writer, as a director. And that really, for me, has been, my pathway, right? And it's really today, I'm really fortunate. It informs how I do my job as chief risk officer, and being able to see it from all those vantage points.
With those different vantage points, those different experiences, and now that you're up at the top of the risk pyramid, what are you looking for when you hire someone to be a top lieutenant for you or your right hand person? What kinds of backgrounds or things are the skills that you really look for to support you in the organization?
That's a great question. So it depends a little bit on what the position is, right? So certain positions may require very, very deep, quantitative skills as an example, right? Other positions may require, a deep ability to frame and nuance and create frameworks across, right? In general, though, the skill set that I look for is somebody technically deep at whatever the area is. Are they able to aggregate the risk of what they're seeing in a way that their audiences, and they may have many audiences or stakeholders, will understand, right? So, can they
Mhm.
communicate that basically? And then, are they what I call really good thinkers? Can they think about the here and now? Can they think about what might happen in the future? Can they think about the past? Can they develop tools, if you will, to put those risks in perspective and try basically to look forward to what might emerge, right? And sometimes that can be very deep tool building, truly a tool, right? A
Mhm.
forecasting device. But it can also be an analytical model to say, these three things, if they're present, could lead to X. This is what we
Right.
should be worried about, right? So mental models, analytical models are really, really critical. And some of that I really would call is curiosity. Are you
Mhm.
curious? Are you thinking about it? If A, then B, then C, what are the properties that you think give rise to X? And can you stimulate that discussion so we're really, really on our game? So
Right.
that's one area. I think another area is, can you take that and operationalize, right? So we
Mhm.
can talk, we can worry about the future, but ultimately we need to do something, right? So what is it we
Mhm.
are going to do, and how does that get articulated Is it that in a tolerance? Is that in a limit? Is that in a guideline? Is that in a discussion with the business to change how we do the business or curb certain businesses? What is the manifestation really of that thinking, and does that have positive impact on the organization? So those are the things that I really look for.
Hmm.
I also think, at senior positions, it's important to be a good leader and
Hmm.
bring, the more junior people along and help train them and help shape them so that
Hmm.
they can be future leaders. So that's an aspect also.
Right. We've touched on it a few times today, and I think just to hit home that communication point is so essential that there are some people who I've met in my career who have been absolutely brilliant, but that did not come through because of poor communication skills. And
Mm,
it doesn't matter how high your grades were in college, it doesn't matter how brilliant your solution is that you design in the workplace. If you can't communicate it to other people, and as you move up into a leadership role, get buy-in from the other decision makers, all of that brilliance goes to waste. And so I think that communication point, both in risk and in law, it has been a key skill that I've seen again and again from the top leaders.
You know what, Matthew, I have to really agree with you. And I kind of bucketize that really into three things. I think there's the verbal, right? How do you explain it? Can you get people to understand it? There's the written, and that can be in a brief, that could be a memo, that could be, a really good email. But there's also, and people may, there's also kind of that aspect of PowerPointing as well, right? And that's a little bit of a hybrid. It's kind of a visualization, basically, of an issue with the pertinent points with a lot of content, but, pictorially also helping to represent what the issue at hand is, right? And that idea of a picture is worth 1,000 words, or a diagram to kind of explain how you might think about something with the punchy points on it is
Hmm.
critical. And, I think I look for all of that. Those three items help what I call transmission. It
Hmm.
helps us to understand what is the problem, how might we align to solve it, where are the pros, where are the cons, and what are those next steps, and are we all really on the same page, right? And
Right.
so I would completely agree with you that's really, it's kind of the lifeblood, if you will,
Yeah.
of a super seasoned, adroit risk manager, and sounds like lawyer as well.
Yeah. Yes. Well, the audience can't see me smiling, but there have been all the times I've received a PowerPoint from usually another lawyer, and they are quite proud at the number of words they've managed to fit on the
Uh-oh.
slide. And they're like, well, I fit it all onto one slide. And my answer is yes, but I can't read it. And if I can't read it, then the executive we're dealing with definitely is not going to read it. There's no way they're going to study that 300 word PowerPoint slides you put together. That you have to break it down either into simpler concepts, into multiple
Yep.
slides, or as you said, if you can do a graphic, even better. So
Yeah. It's a little like, it's the wrong medium, right?
yep.
It's like trying to do a Broadway play, on television, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Well, Kim, thank
Uh,
you so much for participating in the Credibly Challenged podcast. I think we covered some good ground today. We really highlighted some of the importance of good communication, of good planning within an organization, and also, operating collaboratively with your peers. And so I want to thank you, and also I want to thank our audience for tuning in. Without you, we wouldn't have a program, and we really appreciate you listening to our monthly programs.
Great. Thank you so much, Matthew. And thank you to the audience also for tuning in. This was quite a pleasure. Thanks so much.